Good evening, and welcome to this interview with Dr. Leonie Foster.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is all ours. Dr. Foster is the author of High Hopes, The Men and Motives of the Australian Round Table. Your book is a study of the Round Table movement, but with its focus on Australia, correct?
That's right. I do touch on the founding of the Round Table in Britain and the visits of British members to Australia, but for the most part one wrote primarily about the Australian Round Table groups.
Tell me a little about your background as a historian.
When I wrote the book, I was actually a shipwreck historian and a research officer with the Victoria Archaeological Survey and its Maritime Archaeological Unit.
That's very interesting. But how did you become a Round Table researcher?
The book grew out of my PhD thesis at LaTrobe University, which I completed in 1985, but I had also done research on the Imperial Federation League, which, like the Round Table, had a strong presence in Australia. As far as an inspirational source goes, there were two. It was Professor John Liggy of Monash University who had alerted me to the longevity of the Round Table groups in Australia. You see, I had thought they died out much earlier than they really did.
And your other inspirational source?
Professor John Kendall of the University of Manitoba in Canada.
The author of the Round Table Movement and Imperial Union. Yes, I spoke to him about his book in an earlier interview. You say his research was pioneering in your book.
Yes, I did. In fact, he had done so much work that I was afraid there was little left to learn about the Round Table groups in Australia.
Would it be fair to say that you followed the lead of Professor Kendall? You certainly seem to echo his main arguments and lines of thought.
Yes, you could say so. In fact, he paid me the honor of writing the foreword to my book.
So you and he are in basic agreement about the Round Table's objectives and level of influence?
Very much so, although you have to take into account the political conditions in Australia, which were different from those in Britain, and which affected the level of influence that was exerted by the Round Table.
When I spoke to Professor Kendall, I told him that his book seemed to be a refutation of Professor Carroll Quigley's view of the Round Table. Your book, however, doesn't address Quigley directly.
Yes, that's right. In fact, I don't cite him as one of my sources, except for his article about the Canadian Round Table groups.
So his theories are just balderdash, as far as you're concerned.
Well, from what I know of them, they are rather extreme. I think Professor Kendall did a wonderful job of presenting a more balanced and nuanced picture of the Round Table.
Since he wrote your foreword, let me ask you a quick question about that.
All right.
I had trouble with his very first sentence. He wrote, "The Round Table movement was formed in 1909 by a group of young men who had served in South Africa with Lord Milner." That's just wrong, isn't it?
Why is it wrong?
The Round Table was formed by these young men and Milner. He was their leader, their father figure, their means of financial support. Without Milner, there would have been no Round Table movement.
I don't know about that. Milner was an important member, but people like Lionel Curtis and Philip Carr supplied the ideas and energy that got it going.
Without Milner's access to the Rhodes Trust and his political connections, do you really think Lionel Curtis could have made it to Australia and started groups there?
Of course not, he obviously needed funding.
As did they all. Yet, from the very first sentence of your book, Professor Kendall tries to minimize the role of Milner in the affairs of the Round Table. And in the next sentence he says something else that is unhistorical.
Unhistorical?
Yes, it's blatantly unhistorical. He says, the experiences of Milner's kindergarten in helping to bring about South African Union led them to the conviction that the British Empire needed to unite in order to ensure its interests were fully protected in an increasingly hostile world.
Yes, I recall he wrote that, but there's nothing unhistorical about it.
It wasn't the experience of helping South Africa unite that made them want to unite the British Empire. They already thought that way. Milner had thought that way too. He had been making speeches in favor of Imperial Federation long before 1909. His closest friend was George Parkin, who had been head of the Imperial Federation League. So it's wrong and very misleading to say that they were converted to the cause of Imperial Federation by their experiences in South Africa.
So what are you saying?
That their South African experiences were an excuse they used to promote Imperial Federation, just as was their belief that the British Empire faced an increasingly hostile world.
You have a rather strident viewpoint, but I suppose, strictly speaking, there is something to that argument. In Professor Kendall's defense, he was writing a very short preface, just a couple of pages, and it can be very difficult to condense what one writes in such a way that it is entirely accurate and succinct.
You're probably right. In any case, let's discuss what you wrote.
I am happy to start.
I always find it interesting to see what students of the Round Table say about the movement's purposes and influence. You have a whole chapter on the subject of influence that I found to be very interesting.
Well, the question of Round Table influence is a difficult one that it is tempting to try to avoid. It's not something that can be easily seen and measured.
You quoted the famous Australian historian W.K. Hancock in that regard.
It was something he told me when I interviewed him. Don't ignore influence, because it can't be measured. Often the most important issues can't be quantified.
That is a remarkable quote. And he was saying it as a former Round Table member himself.
That's right. He started as an Australian Round Table member, and then he moved to Britain, where he joined the main Round Table group in London. But then he resigned his membership in 1936, because of the support of men like Philip Carr and Geoffrey Dawson for the policy of appeasing Nazi Germany.
He had a first-hand look at Round Table influence, at least there in Britain.
Yes, although it would be a mistake to say that the Round Table promoted appeasement as a definite policy. Lionel Curtis, for example, did nothing to promote it, and Robert Brand actively opposed it.
Fair enough. What about in Australia? You seem to differ from Professor Kendall's ideas about Round Table influence. He argues that the Round Table actually declined in influence once its members gained access to power because they were too busy or preoccupied to push their agendas.
I think you're right that I do differ on Professor Kendall on that point. He may be correct about the London Round Table group, but the situation was different in Australia. My research made it rather clear that the movement definitely wanted to influence events. Whether they did, and to what extent, remains unclear.
It's unquantifiable.
Yes, exactly. Another problem is that we must define what kind of influence we are talking about. Overt influence. Indirect influence. The influence of an idea. Take the term Commonwealth as an example.
All right.
Lionel Curtis liked to take credit for inventing that word to describe the British Empire, but he really didn't. What he did was to popularize the term until it eventually became used widely even in official documents. And while he did succeed in transforming the word Commonwealth into common usage, he did not succeed in promoting the ideas behind that word.
The idea of federating the British Empire, which would then be Curtis's vision of a Commonwealth.
Yes. This is something that Professor Kendall argues in his book, and with which I agree. Now if you're talking about specific concrete policies that came about as a result of Round Table influence, then there are a few examples. But in terms of lasting influence, I think the Round Table had more success at promoting ideas and attitudes, not specific policies.
What kind of attitudes? Like closer Anglo-American relations?
That might be one, but I'm talking about attitudes within the British Empire towards itself. Specifically, it supported the idea of a multiracial Commonwealth instead of one dominated by the white dominions.
That's an idea quite different from Lord Milner's when the Round Table started.
Indeed it was. He described himself as a British race patriot, and he assumed that white men of British stock would always govern the empire. The idea that Indians or black Africans would somehow help to govern the empire would have been preposterous to him.
So it's rather remarkable that his followers came to hold such a radical viewpoint.
Quite remarkable. Professor Kendall and I both agree that one type of influence exercised by the Round Table was to encourage self-examination, to question the direction the empire was taking and the changes in its structure that resulted.
You mention other types of influence as well.
There were some limited attempts to affect government policy, but not much came out of these, especially in the area of promoting closer ties with Britain.
Why did they fail?
primarily because of Australian nationalism. No one, not even Australian roundtablers, was really willing to lose even a small amount of Australian political autonomy. Members favoured a strong empire that could protect Australian interests, but they always balked at taking steps that might lead to a loss of autonomy.
What about non-political influence?
Well, now here you get into a type of influence that is very interesting. It's pervasive and long-lasting, but not quantifiable. That is the influence that their writings have had on our understanding of Australian history.
You mean Australian historiography?
No, although that is part of it. You see, when the Round Table Journal was founded in 1910, there was no comparable publication that covered imperial affairs, much less Australian affairs, in a comprehensive manner. Very slowly there were specialised scholarly journals that appeared in Australia, but for a very long time the Round Table was the only publication that commented on events in Australia. As a result, historians now must consult these old issues of the Round Table and use them as sources for their research.
That's a subtle but pervasive influence.
Indeed it is. And it is an influence that will be permanent, because we will never have other primary sources of that scope and covering that place and time period. Even scholars who disagree with the ideology of the Round Table's writers are forced to use it as a source, such as anti-imperialist or Marxist historians.